In February 2018, Nick Nanavati won the Las Vegas Open on one of the most controversial plays in Warhammer history. Everybody remembers the play, but here's the part nobody talks about: what he did after he won, and what he did years later when the internet discovered the clip and turned his opponent into a punchline. The plays were almost identical. Nick and the man he beat in the final had both invoked strict timing rules at the same tournament, hours apart, against different opponents. One became the most trusted name in competitive Warhammer. The other became a meme. The difference had nothing to do with the rules themselves. February 2018, Las Vegas. The convention center has been running Warhammer 40K games for 2 days straight, 473 players having collapsed through 7 rounds of Swiss pairings down to 8 competitors. By the morning of day 3, the bracket is 8 players. By midday, 4. By mid-afternoon, 2. Nick Nanavati and Tony Grappando, both from New Jersey, both members of Team USA for the European Team Championships, sitting down across from each other on the main stage table, the one that has been live-streamed on Twitch to thousands of viewers since Friday. The LVO, the Las Vegas Open, is the largest competitive Warhammer 40K event in the world, a Games Workshop super major. At the end of a 3-day grind through hundreds of opponents, the last 2 players at the venue sit under lights, dice rolling across painted terrain, the specific texture of high-level competition. Quiet focus, interrupted by brief, tense exchanges, both players running the math on every sequence before committing to it. The stakes are specific and documented. Tony Grappando had entered the weekend as the leader in the independent tournament circuit standings, the ITC, which tracks competitive Warhammer performance across hundreds of events worldwide and awards a $4,000 cash prize to the year-end champion. Nick was sitting third. The math was simple. Nick winning the LVO meant Tony losing his ITC lead and the money. Beyond the ITC, the LVO title itself carried real weight. The winner's name engraved on the event's Thunderhammer trophy, the permanent record of having been the best in the room at the biggest event in the world. Frontline Gaming's tournament coverage noted it plainly. Neither Nick Nanavati or Tony Grappando have ever been to a top 8 at the Las Vegas Open, and have come very close multiple times. This game will prop either player into the history books as one of the best ever. That framing was accurate. The reason it became accurate had almost nothing to do with the competitive result. Nick Nanavati started playing Warhammer in 2004, aged 10, at a New Jersey shop called The Only Game in Town. His first major tournament was the Grand Tournament Baltimore around 2008. He placed poorly. He came back because competitive 40K has a specific gravitational pull for a certain kind of mind. The combination of list construction, in-game decision-making, and the ecosystem of serious players who show up to these things and sharpen each other. Nick had that kind of mind. He traveled more. He got better. He started placing consistently. By 2013, he was winning Adepticon, the premier U.S. championship event, beating a player named Tony Kopak. Different Tony, different year. In the final, claiming a spot on Team USA for the European Team Championships. From there, the titles accumulated with the consistency of someone who had identified what the game required and built his game around it. 4 Adepticon championship titles, multiple Nova Invitational wins, 2 ETC gold medals representing Team USA at the international level, an ATC title, 6 consecutive years qualifying for Team America. He was one of the rare competitive players whose dominance crossed editions, finding the necessary adjustments as each meta shifted rather than fading when his previous approaches stopped working. The 2017 ITC season was the one he consciously decided to take seriously. At the end of the 2016 season, he'd been sitting around 364th in standings. His own account of why. He dropped from events as soon as he lost, bring armies he wanted to experiment with to high-point events rather than the most competitive options available. He described it later with characteristic self-awareness. At the end of the year, while his friends competed for the championship title, he was sitting at 364th, calculating if there's any way to win a faction award. He made a decision. He committed to the full circuit. He stopped dropping after losses. He traveled to every available scoring event and played every round with intention rather than whim. At the end of the 2017 season, he was the ITC champion. Going into LVO 2018, he was the reigning title holder, which meant he arrived as the primary target for everyone in the field with ITC ambitions. Tony Grappando specifically, who had been accumulating points all year to hold the standings lead going into the season finale. The week before Las Vegas, Nick was at Sean Naden's in-laws' house for a practice session with Naden, Tony Grappando, and Brad Chester, 4 of the top competitive 40K players in North America, a weekend before the biggest event of the year, testing lists and playing games. The first night, Nick and Brad Chester were up until 5:30 in the morning, working through whether Wraith Lords, a unit generally regarded as below the competitive tier they were operating at, had any play in the current meta. They exhausted the possibility. The second night involved a 6-hour game with Tony running over 200 Poxwalkers. Competitive obsession has that quality. The willingness to run through scenarios that are probably wrong just to rule them out. To stay up until 5:30 a.m. testing a unit because you can't afford to wonder about it later. Tony spent that weekend absorbing Nick's Ynnari list concept. By the time they arrived in Las Vegas, Tony was running a near copy of Nick's own army against him. Nick described this afterward with dry affection. Mr. Copycat Grappando audibling to Eldar after weekend at Bernie's, Sean's. They'd practiced against each other with nearly identical lists. They understood each other's game plans at the level of detail that only comes from sharing a table for 2 days straight, testing the same edge cases, seeing how the opponent adjusts. That was the human relationship walking into the grand final. Competitive rivals who had been genuinely friendly shared a practice house for a weekend and were now at opposite ends of a match that would significantly change both their careers. But before the grand final, Tony had played a different match, and the community had watched all of it on stream. LVO 2018, Day 3, Game 2, the semifinal. Alexander Fennell, multiple GT winner including a previous LVO performance, running Space Wolves and Imperium, against Tony Grappando, running Eldari Ynnari. Both players knew each other from the circuit. Both were due to represent Team USA together at the European Team Championships that year. Before the match started, according to multiple accounts from the event and from subsequent community and judge documentation, the two agreed to play by intent rather than strict letter of law. A pre-game social compact. The acknowledgement that at the highest levels of competition, 2 reasonable people can agree to prioritize the spirit of what they're doing over procedural technicalities. Salty John, one of the LVO's head judges, confirmed it directly in subsequent community discussion. That kind of agreement, once made, couldn't be discarded for tactical advantage. Tony and Alex made that agreement. Both were clear about it. Tony got first turn and spent 1 hour of the match's 2.5-hour time limit on it. 1 hour. Alex was now running a game under real clock pressure in addition to managing his army. When Alex's turn began, Tony came around to Alex's side of the table. He assisted Alex in measuring positions for his assassin and deep striker units, where they could land, what they could reach. It was a collegial gesture between players who knew each other. Alex let Tony measure. In competitive Warhammer, having an opponent help with logistics carries an implicit good faith assumption. The game is complicated. Sometimes a measurement requires 2 sets of hands. Alex deployed an assassin during his movement phase. In 8th edition, assassins had to be deployed at the end of the movement phase, not during it. Alex had placed his unit before completing movement of his other units, an order of operations mistake. Written clearly in the rules, a real error. Alex had committed a real violation of a real rule. Tony invoked it. Under the strict application, Alex couldn't perform any further movement with the rest of his army in that phase. His assault-based force, built around units designed to close distance and make contact, inherently useless if they can't move, was frozen in its own deployment zone. Against a Inari list that had positioned for optimal board control, an assault army that can't approach has no functional path to winning. The stream captured what followed. Alex sat back. He recognized the mistake immediately, without argument. He admitted it on camera, in front of thousands of live viewers, without looking for a technicality to walk it back. He didn't contest it. He didn't make excuses. He acknowledged he had made the error. He could have conceded right there and walked away with his semifinalist placing. The game was over in any practical sense. Instead, Alex Fennell chose to play it out. He and Tony ran the full game on the live stream. Alex fought a battle he couldn't win with the same engagement he'd brought to every other match in the tournament, managing his army, making decisions, giving the stream something real to watch. The Beasts of War event coverage described it as a real act of sportsmanship. By choosing to play out the game, Alex had ensured the broadcast didn't go dead between rounds, had given thousands of viewers a full semifinal to watch, and had absorbed a procedural ruling that ended his tournament chances with a grace he was entirely under no obligation to display. One of those thousands watching was Mark Merrill, co-founder of Riot Games. He was moved enough by Alex's conduct, specifically by Alex's response, not by the ruling, to donate a $5,000 sportsmanship award during the broadcast itself. Not afterward, during the stream, publicly, as a direct response to what he was watching in real time. Alex took the donation and reached out to his employer, who agreed to match it, $10,000 to a children's hospital. Games Workshop contributed further. The total exceeded $15,000, donated by 3 separate organizations in direct response to one player choosing to lose with dignity. The Reddit threads appeared within hours. Tony getting Tonied, named the ironic logic that had just completed in real time. The community had watched the full sequence unfold on stream. Tony will forever be painted with the brush that he created. The analysis in competitive Warhammer communities on Reddit was consistent. The problem wasn't the enforcement, it was the trap. Tony had come around the table and helped create the exact situation he then called illegal, after agreeing pre-match to play by intent. Frontline Gaming's post-event piece coined the nickname. Tony, super helpful here, let me measure that for you, grippando, and was careful about something important. Tony, super helpful here, let me measure that for you, grippando, was not wrong in enforcing an order of operations mistake on Alex. The rule was real. The mistake was real. The enforcement was technically legal. And yet, nobody on the stream, at the event, or wearing the skin of Tony or Alex for 1 second thought it was okay. The specific violation wasn't procedural. It was the pre-game agreement. Salty John confirmed it. They made an agreement. He broke it to gain an advantage that isn't allowed in the code of conduct. Tony had agreed to play by intent and discarded that agreement at exactly the moment it cost him something. Tony won the semifinal. He advanced to the grand final. He reportedly apologized afterward to the event organizers for how the incident had reflected on the tournament. The community registered where the apology had been directed. Fennell was the one who took the crowd's favor, despite losing. Tony walked into the grand final as the most talked about player at the event, for reasons that had nothing to do with his list. Both players in the final were running Inari. This detail matters more than it might seem on the surface. Inari were the dominant faction in 8th edition's competitive meta. Their core mechanic, called Soul Burst as part of the Strength from Death rule, triggered an extra action for a nearby unit whenever an enemy unit was completely destroyed within 7 inches. It made the precise sequencing of deaths strategically critical, and it made timing rules matter at a level specific to this faction. Every destroyed unit was a potential trigger. Every trigger had conditions. The timing and order of those conditions were the operational currency of competitive Ynnari play, and both players had spent the 2017 to 2018 season building their game around understanding exactly where those rules applied. 8th edition's list-building environment had also allowed what players called soup, combining units from multiple codexes under broad faction keywords like Eldari. And the dominant Ynnari builds of that era folded the strongest units from across the Eldar range into a single optimized force. Nick's list ran Yvrain alongside Wave Serpents for durability and infantry units designed to chain soulburst triggers across the board. 5 of the 8 players in the LVO 2018 Top 8 had been running some version of Eldar. The 2 in the final were running the version that had been determined, over the course of the competitive season, to be the most powerful. They had practiced with these lists against each other the prior week. They knew what the other person's army could do because they'd spent 6 hours testing it. The turns were timed. Both were aware of the clock in addition to the board state. The Thunderhammer trophy was visible behind the table. During the match, a rules call was made regarding Tony's ability to use a Ynnari stratagem. The Frontline Gaming Twitch stream from that afternoon, archived publicly and still viewable, preserves the exchange in real time. The community documentation that followed in the hours after was immediate and specific. Tony getting Tony'd had already been circulating as a thread title since the semifinal. Now, the logic it described had landed. The Ynnari player who couldn't use the stratagem exploit lost. Nick was visibly frustrated during the match. Commentators noted it in real time. His conduct was a little short-tempered. He was getting tired of his opponent's behavior at the table. These were 2 players who had practiced together the prior week, who had sat across from each other in a friendly house playing test games, and who were now competing with the full context of the morning semifinal hanging over the table. The frustration was documented, specific, and entirely human. He was managing a match against an opponent whose behavior earlier that day had generated community condemnation across social media in real time, while simultaneously competing for a title and a year-end championship swing with $4,000 attached. All of that was happening at once, and it showed on camera. He wasn't performing patience he didn't feel. He was annoyed and competitive and pushing through a difficult match under difficult conditions. He enforced what needed enforcing. He won. What the stream then captured in the minutes immediately after the last dice roll is where the entire character study resolves. The Goonhammer piece on competitive sportsmanship, published a year after LVO 2018, was specific about the community response. But even more important than the elation and satisfaction of winning the tournament was the positivity surrounding the final match on social media. Not the competitive result, not the ITC standings consequence, not the title itself. The positivity surrounding the final match's post-game conduct was what the community registered most strongly. The stream showed the handshake. According to the video's commentary, and the community documenting the clip in real time, what came with it was Nick acknowledging the game for what it had actually been, a hard, real, genuinely competitive match between 2 players who knew each other's armies and had pushed each other. The acknowledgement of a competitor by another competitor after a serious contest. Not ceremonial, not for the camera. The community watching the stream read it as actual, and they documented their reading of it with the same energy they'd brought to documenting the semifinal. The contrast was stark, and it landed immediately. Tony and Alex Fennell had also had a post-match moment on a streamed stage. That moment produced a $15,000 donation chain and a nickname that would follow Tony for years. The post-match moment in the grand final produced something different: admiration. Not just for the LVO title, but for how it was claimed. 1 year later, December 2019, the Pro Tabletop Open in Atlanta, $10,000 on the line in the final round. Nick Nanavati in the final against Richard Siegler. In the decisive final turn of the match, Nick voluntarily told Siegler that his Fusion Cold Star Commander was in Melta range and would roll 2d6 for damage rather than 1d6, unprompted. He offered information that could only help his opponent at the exact moment when the result was balanced on individual dice rolls. Siegler documented it on Goonhammer afterward, with the specific context that made it notable. At the final round of the Pro Tabletop Open event in Atlanta, December 2019, with $10,000 on the line, Nick Nanavati reminded me that my Fusion Cold Star Commander was in Melta range and so would roll 2d6 when determining damage. He did so completely unprompted and with hard cash and a Super Bowl-style ring on the line in the final, crucial turn of the match. He prioritized sportsmanship. This isn't the behavior of two different Nicks operating under different rules in different contexts. It's the same operational principle appearing in different moments. Rules as a standard, applied consistently in both directions, irrespective of who they benefit. The same person who was visibly short-tempered during a tense championship match was also the person who volunteered information that could cost him a $10,000 final a year later. Both behaviors come from the same place, a relationship with the rules that uses them as a shared standard rather than as a personal weapon. The community's debate ran for months. It still surfaces in various forms whenever competitive gaming communities process the question of strict rule enforcement at high-stakes events. The case for strict enforcement at the LVO level isn't morally thin. Competitive Warhammer at this scale isn't a casual game. Players travel internationally, pay entry fees, invest months of preparation. The rules are known in advance. Everyone who enters the LVO championships has agreed, implicitly, to operate in a competitive environment where those rules are enforced. An order of operations mistake in a semifinal of the largest tournament in the world on a live stream stage is a different category from forgetting a rule in a round one game at a local RTT. The argument that normalizing leniency at the top table undermines competitive integrity across the entire system has real force. If experienced players at the highest level can retract mistakes based on relationship or context, or how sympathetic the stream audience is, the rules aren't really rules in any meaningful competitive sense. Multiple Reddit threads made exactly this case. The position wasn't that Tony was likable. It was that Alex made a real mistake against a real rule, and Tony called it. A competitive environment where that doesn't happen is one where the value of knowing the rules decreases, where preparation is less rewarded than improvisation, where the gap between what you practiced and what you enforced depends on how the crowd is feeling. The community's specific objection to Tony's semifinal enforcement was never the enforcement itself. Frontline Gaming confirmed he wasn't wrong. The objection was the trap. The hour-long first turn that left Alex time-pressured. The deliberate assistance with the measurement before invoking the violation. The pre-game agreement to play by intent discarded at the exact moment it became convenient to discard it. Each element individually might have been defensible. The combination wasn't. The Magic: The Gathering competitive community had developed shorthand for a structurally similar situation. Two explores, referring to an incident where a player illegally took an extra trigger from a card called Explore. The phrase became standard reference for situations where technically legal or near-legal play felt like cheating. Not a clear-cut rules violation, but using the gap between the letter and the spirit of a rule as an offensive instrument. The distinction between enforcing rules and weaponizing them is recognized across competitive gaming communities, even when it's hard to define in strictly legal terms. The Magic community had two explores. Competitive Warhammer, after LVO 2018, had Tony. Nick's enforcement in the final had none of those elements. No coming around the table to help position units before calling the violation. No pre-game agreement to play by intent that was later discarded. No hour-long turn spent consuming the opponent's clock. a timing rule enforced in a competitive match against a player who had, hours earlier, used timing rules as a precision trap. The symmetry was clean enough to name in real time, and the community had named it before the grand final was even over. Whether you agreed that Tony's semifinal enforcement was wrong, and principled voices maintained throughout that the rule was real, the mistake was Alex's, and the enforcement was legitimate. The structural distinction between Tony's method and Nick's wasn't just moral. Tony had assisted with the positioning before invoking. Nick hadn't. That difference isn't a matter of interpretation. After LVO 2018, Nick Nanavati kept winning. He also built something that outlasted any individual championship. Art of War is now the dominant coaching and educational infrastructure in competitive Warhammer 40K. He founded it. His stated reason: "I've been playing Warhammer for 20 years and fell in love with the community through the process. My passions have since moved into helping others become better and enjoy their hobby more." The platform he built reflects that mission in concrete structural terms. 3 coaching tiers: Bronze at $177 per month for 25-minute weekly sessions, Silver at $277 for 45 minutes, Gold at $500 for hour-long weekly sessions with the best players in the world. A private subscriber community called The War Room, built around coaching videos and high-level competitive discussion. A podcast, The Art of War Competitive 40K Network, which reached 642 episodes as of early 2026, running weekly and covering faction meta, list construction, and tournament analysis for serious competitive players. The coaches Art of War assembled include Richard Siegler, who won back-to-back ITC championships in 2019 and 2020, Jack Harpster, the 2022 ITC champion, John Lennon, a longtime champion with multiple faction specializations, a roster whose collective tournament record represents some of the best sustained competitive performance in the game's history. Nick took on coaching clients personally while also continuing to compete at the highest level himself. He took a role with Games Workshop as their official Warhammer commentator for global events. In January 2026, Art of War won the Las Vegas Teams Tournament, the LVO's team event, with Nick still on the active roster. A Frontline Gaming interview after the win had him discussing team dynamics and decision-making under pressure, recognizable themes for someone who had been operating at competitive pressure since 2004. Frontline Gaming's 2021 profile identified the trajectory clearly. Nick had transformed himself from just a competitor to an educator and 40,000 professional. Their assessment of his influence on the broader scene: "It's hard to think of any individual person outside of rules writers and GW staff who has influenced how we play the game of Warhammer 40,000 over the past few years more than Nick Nanavati." Not the best player, specifically, though the argument for that is defensible, but the most influential shaper of how the entire competitive community understands and approaches the game. This matters for what came next because of what it established. When a retrospective video about LVO 2018 surfaced years after the events it described, Nick wasn't a historical footnote. He was active, winning, recognized across the competitive community as its most influential non-GW figure. His name in a comment section carried weight that an ordinary viewer's opinion couldn't replicate. His first-person account of what Tony was like to play against years after the incident meant something that no amount of analysis or community speculation could substitute for. He had a choice about whether to use that weight. The video surfaced years after the events it covered. How 40K's most infamous play changed competitive Warhammer forever. A retrospective piece making the case that LVO 2018 had been a watershed moment in how the community processed competitive conduct norms. The title wasn't wrong. The controversy had generated more sustained community discussion about what competitive play should look like than almost any other single event in the game's recent history. New community members had been receiving the story secondhand for years. Old members had been processing a settled verdict. The video gave both groups a clean synthesis of the incident and an audience of sufficient size to restart active discussion. Comment sections on competitive gaming retrospectives operate on predictable logic. The person who is wronged gets sympathy. The person who committed the wrong gets contempt. Tony Grappando had become, in the years since LVO 2018, competitive Warhammer's canonical example of poor sportsmanship at the highest level. The reference points cited informed discussions about rules lawyering, the name that came up when someone wanted to illustrate why strict enforcement without integrity was corrosive to competitive culture. The comment section was doing what comment sections do, confirming a verdict that had been settled for years, finding each other in agreement, adding detail to a shared judgment. Then, Nick Nanavati posted a comment. He identified himself by name. The documented opening. Hello, this is Nick Nanavati. Thank you for sharing this. It's so wonderful to see how one moment has had such an amazing impact across the community. He framed the LVO 2018 incident not as something damaging to revisit, but as a moment that had genuinely mattered, that had driven real conversation about what competitive conduct should look like and left the space better for it. He wrote about the incident and the game with the warmth of someone who had spent 20 years inside both and valued what he'd found there. Then he reportedly wrote about Tony, that Tony had grown in the years since, that their games in subsequent events had been genuinely enjoyable, a different experience from what the community had witnessed at LVO 2018. A direct, first-person account from the only person who had the standing to make it credibly. Nick's comment drew more engagement than any other in the video's section by a considerable margin. Some of that is the mechanics of celebrity. When the most recognizable figure in competitive Warhammer shows up in a comment section on a video about himself, engagement follows regardless of content. First-person testimony from the actual participant in a famous incident who has full context, who maintained a relationship with the other participant, who can speak from knowledge rather than speculation, is a content advantage that analysis can't replicate. The engagement figures reflect who was posting as much as what was posted. But some of it was the content. The comment section had been doing easy work, confirming a verdict everyone already held. Nick's comment offered something the comment section couldn't generate internally, new information that complicated the settled judgment without excusing it. He didn't give the internet its free villain back. He said the villain had grown up. He said it under his own name, with the full weight of everything he'd built since 2018 attached to his word. He had every incentive to stay silent. The community's consensus about Tony had been stable since 2018 and served Nick perfectly well. Distance from the controversy cost him nothing. He could have watched the comments section process the incident without him and collected the implicit social validation of being obviously the better actor in a famous story. Instead, he used whatever authority came with being the most influential figure in competitive Warhammer to push back on the easy villainization. Not to excuse what had happened, to say, that was then, this is now, here's who he actually is. Small choices made freely, without incentive, are the ones that tell you what someone actually is. Tony Grappando and Nick Nanavati both enforced strict timing rules at the LVO 2018 championships, hours apart in the same bracket. Both called real rules against real mistakes. One became the most trusted name in the game, the person who built the coaching infrastructure that the whole competitive community runs through, who kept winning championships into his 30s, who chose, years later, to complicate a community verdict that had nothing to offer him but easy approval. The other became competitive Warhammer's canonical example of how not to win. The rules don't explain the difference. The rules were the same. What the rules don't contain is whether you helped construct the trap before invoking them, whether you discarded a pregame agreement to play by intent at the exact moment it became inconvenient, whether you were visibly frustrated during a championship match and chose to conduct yourself with grace when it ended, whether you volunteered information to a finals opponent that cost you an advantage when you had no obligation to say anything, whether you showed up years later under your own name, with the internet offering you a free villain to agree about, and declined the offer. Nick Nanavati wasn't a saint in the LVO 2018 final. He was tired and annoyed and operating under the weight of everything on the line: the ITC Championship and the $4,000 and the Thunderhammer, and the full awareness of what his opponent had done that morning. He was human in the match. He was something more specific than human when the match was over, and more specific still, years later, when the internet handed him the comfortable role of the man who had always been right, and he chose to make the story more complicated instead. Same sword, two different people holding it. The community understood the difference when it watched one of those people choose to put it down. Subscribe for more stories like this.